a sports scientist? Like, how did you get into your role?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, strength coach. I mean, I started the classic journey, played football in college at Humboldt State, Cal Poly now, and then was a GA there. Moved into the private sector for a couple years. My wife got a job selling elevators, actually. So we moved to San Francisco. So I was in the private sector and worked my way up to being a COO of a multi-million-dollar training facility there for a little bit. And then COVID happened. So the private sector kind of just disappeared, right? So that became, well, I wanted to get the PhD. Now's a good time.
Uh,
So I actually was planning on going to New Zealand to work with the All Blacks at Auckland University of Technology and do some like force velocity profiling things there with them. But the student visa very quickly became no longer a plus one, if that makes sense. So the girlfriend at the time, wifey now, wasn't going to be able to join. And so Hawaii was kind of the next thing on the list. And so I ended up out here. And it turns out they didn't have a sports science program. So yes, background in strength and conditioning, but always kind of utilized the data heavily in my practice. And that just kind of developed to becoming a sports scientist. So
how were you able to get that sports science program up and running then? Because we have some strength coaches that are trying to do that.
that is a challenging task. First and foremost, the most important way is just protecting the narrative and really being aware of the lens and starting a sports science program. It really leads to, hey, what technology do you have? I mean, it's recognizing the organization and university as a whole. The majority of them are not in high performance settings when everyone's collaborating and they're all in silos. And so you're going to have to go to every coach and say, hey, you guys have GPS? Oh, do you need some help? Maybe use like making decisions. And like once you get in that way, coaches that have been there a while and have been winning, they're going to start inviting you to join as well. You know what I mean? So it was just kind of a one step process. But for me, I got invited to be the sports scientist for football right away. And, when football hops on and it works for them, everyone else wanted a piece. Basically became football, then football, beach volleyball, soccer. At the time I was working with those three, it basically became full time. And then the university was kind of like, wait a second, what are you doing? Like, let's just get everyone force plates. Let's get everybody GPS. Let's just launch this thing. So the reason I share that in that way, it's the narrative was really important, right? The story and like the how and how it happened, so to say. Just because there's a lot of misnomers about sports science and just like, oh, you do less, and it's like, it's not about doing less, it's just doing more at the right time. Like, let's train smarter and harder, not less. And you kind of have to break down those barriers. Once those are there and coaches trust you, then you can get rolling. So easiest way to answer that question was it would be just be a systems engineer, like create systems in place where there's weekly high performance meetings that the strength coach is at, the athletic trainers at, the operations team is at, the athletic, like academic advisors are there, nutritionists is there. And if you have that functioning at every level and every team, at a certain point, you become the hub, the director of performance in a way, because you're the one helping orchestrate all the decisions made across high performance sport. So if you kind of build it up that way, then if you're doing it well, the invite should follow pretty soon after.
Is that how you got invited to be in charge of the entire department?
Basically, so on paper right now, I'm just a performance and sports scientist. So our org chart isn't set up that way to manage and direct everyone, but I do like facilitate and oversee basically all the sports science initiatives. But yes, that's exactly the process.
Gotcha. So anybody listening in, Trevor and I got connected because of a recent article called Implementing the Reverse Acute to Chronic Workload Ratio Model to Improve Movement Capacity and Roster Availability, looking at an example using data from the NFL. What caused you to want to write this article and do this research?
It's a really good question. I think as someone who used to be in a strength and conditioning seat and now in a sports science seat, how can a sports scientist most appropriately support a strength coach? And I think some of those buckets, for one, was how do you program volume for speed, agility, quickness, and high speed work? And it's a tricky question because you can say, oh, well, you just do a needs analysis, you know how much they need to do, right? But there never really is like, how many 110s do you do for a football team in prepping them for sprinting? And then when you get to sprinting, how many do you do? So this was just a thought process and theory to start to create a quantitative way to prescribe volumes and have an idea of, well, this is how much they get exposed to in the game. Here's in theory, appropriate way to ramp them to that while minimizing injury risk. And so it was just in the process of, doing my role, basically, this is one way to help support a strength coach in their decisions, because this is an approach that it's not saying, oh, you need to do X amount of L drills or this or that. It's just more so like, well,
get CEUs faster, cheaper, and more convenient than ever before with Strength Coach Network. Hey, it's Justin, here to tell you about how Strength Coach Network can now help you out with our premium membership and CEUs to the NSCA and CSCCA. Upon signing up for our premium membership, you will get 2.0 or 10 CEUs immediately. That is an entire year's worth of CEUs that you are able to access from the convenience of your office. No traveling for conferences, no waiting on flights, no eating out, no expensive hotels. Just the good stuff from great coaches. Now, if you need extra CEUs for past years during the reporting period, we can bundle Fundamentals 1 or 2, which also come with 2.0 or 10 CEUs to your purchase. That way, you're able to take care of your CEUs for the best price, most convenient, and learn from some of the best coaches. If you want more help with this, email us at service@Strength Coach Network or visit us at strengthcoachnetwork.com, and I would be delighted to help you out.
how many excels do I need to prep for? How many decels do I need to prep for? And then the strength coach is given their ability and their context can decide how they're going to achieve that goal volume. This is really just designed to help coaches understand the demands of the sport and then an appropriate ramp to get there while minimizing injury risk.
So let's, for purposes, we're going to link the article down below for everybody to be able to read it yourselves. But why don't you talk about, the genesis of it, a little bit of the introduction, the, how you went about coming up with it, and then we can kind of dive into this table here, table 1, table 2. And like I said, it's going to be linked down below. So anybody listening or watching, you can click down and you can read this article from Trevor. But yeah, let's dive into it.
Got you. So I guess to start, if you just think big picture, the pursuit of peak athletic performance really depends on someone's ability to do a good needs analysis. I think that's the first step of being a really, really elite level strength and conditioning coach is doing the needs analysis. And nowadays, GPS, obviously, anytime you see any big program posting workouts, etc., they've got the catapult or connects on across their chest. It's pretty much normative now. But relatively recently, the NFL has actually posted data, GPS data, league-wide for hundreds of athletes across hundreds of games that describe the in vivo or in-game workload demands for those athletes, right? So now we can actually quantify this and know, maybe even if you're at a place that doesn't have GPS, you can have an idea of what's happening at the NFL level. So I decided to use the NFL data as an example. I think it's important to note too that this data set can be applied to any sport. We use this for our soccer team. We use this for our basketball team. We use it for our men's volleyball team, but we just trade out things like high-speed sprints for number of jumps and jump intensity and volumes as well. So that being said, basically with GPS, the if-then logic flows, like the decisions that you can make using that data, one of the big buckets of that is acute to chronic workload ratios and just understanding how much have we been doing compared to what we have been doing. And of course, there's mediators and moderators that are involved in that process, like somebody's strength, etc. So it's not a perfect predictor of injury risk, but at the same time, it gives us an idea. If we're doing 170% of the volume of high-speed running that we have been doing previously, it makes sense that injury risk might be a little higher for hamstrings and things like that too. So within this scope of modeling and monitoring acute to chronic workloads, I basically thought and conceived the idea, well, wait a second, if this is considered the best way to monitor and keep people healthy, safe, secure, and not have blowouts, well, can we reverse engineer this thing backwards so I can actually have target goals of how to prep for a season? So let's say game 1 of the football season, I'm going to scroll down to the table real quick just so I don't throw out a random number. But, as a cornerback, let's say you're going to get on average 66 plays. You're going to have 8 high velocity efforts in a game that you're going to get exposed to.
And what was defined as high velocity based on this again? Let me look. What was
So that'll be in the bands defined. I'm pretty sure that's 18 miles an hour plus, longer than 10 yards or around 10 meters. But those are all functional definitions included in the article and they're cited. But I'm pretty sure that's 18 miles an hour plus off the top of my head. But basically, so when you have GPS data, you have the bands, right? You have velocity bands based on the software that you're using, whether it connects on a catapult. But generally speaking, you'll have bands. And this is the upper echelon of those bands. But let's say a cornerback is going to be exposed to 8 high velo efforts in a game. Well, the thought is, okay, I need to make sure that he's able to handle that load. How would I reverse engineer this acute to chronic workload ratio that says that this is the safest way to progress volumes over time? Then if you just basically think through dividing that value retroactively by 1.3, you're starting to get, you're backtracking and reverse engineering. So then you can calculate eventually, okay, 3 months before, maybe need to hit 5. 2 months before, we need to be hitting 6. 1 month before, we need to be hitting 8 high velocity efforts within a training session. So it just gives kind of a framework, right? And I think there are some limitations in that too. It's important to note, like, if guys have been just chilling on the couch, you're not going to have them come back and just rip 5 max effort, 20-meter sprints too. So there's going to be a ramp even before those 3 months to preparing them for that. But basically the thought process was, how do we use the research and literature that's out there to minimize or mitigate injury risk, maximize roster availability, to assist strength coaches in programming volume for accels, decels, high-speed yards.
And this was all based on that 2015 data that you looked at?
Correct. Yeah, this is just an example using that. I thought that would be a good approach because it's a public data set, right? So this is designed to be like almost like a case study example that if you go through this, if you have any GPS data yourself, you can just take whether it's player load or accumulated accel load, and you can calculate all these things yourself for whatever group you have.
Gotcha. One of my questions was the whole 130 and the acute to chronic workload ratio, and you noted Gabbett in here.
Yeah.
But everything within Gabbett stuff, and I wrote a blog on it, and that'll be linked down below as well. But like, there is no, like, that sweet spot isn't real when you look at that kind of very infamous image that talked about like where that sweet spot was, where it was claimed to be 0.8 to 1.3, like that.
Yep.
That sweet spot, there still are times where you could even approach 2, and the training risk was down by 5. So how did you factor all of that into when you wrote this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if you read into it, right, there's some notes of, like, for example, in rugby, we've seen that threshold value of injury risk starts to increase exponentially around 1.7 acute to chronic. So it's the 1.3 again was just set based on that historical article because a lot of people know that number is. But you can also change the factor when you calculate this based on data in your sport, if that makes sense. So like you could use rugby, for example, thinking that threshold is 1.7, and you can calculate that way as well. So to be clear,
what's up, everybody? Taking a quick break from the show to talk about one of our sponsors, TeamBuildr. I've been using TeamBuildr since 2019 when I was at Towson. I still use it with my remote athletes. I also use it at Goldfinch, which is the private sector gym I train at, and we use it at Centennial, which is the high school that I'm working at. Now, if you're printing on lift cards because you say, oh, I can't afford TeamBuildr, guess what? TeamBuildr has a pre-written grant that you can locate on their website. You simply change the name of you, your organization, and the areas that they highlighted, and they can help you get TeamBuildr at your facility, your university, whatever it is, so that way you can optimize how you train your athletes with this software. Now, TeamBuildr is also a part owner in the Plyomat. The Plyomat is something that I utilize at Goldfinch, and it helps you be able to see how high somebody jumped, the ground contact time, and RSI. You can get all that conveniently right there. You can reach out to your rep from TeamBuildr to be able to get more information on the Plyomat. It's fast, it's reliable, it's convenient, and it's trusted by coaches worldwide. Check them out as well as TeamBuildr in the link down below.
This is just designed to show how you could do it. Every sport, there's different articles that describe where the appropriate acute to chronic ratio actually maybe sits based on data that's published in that sport. And so you can change the factorial of 1.3 to 1.7 to change how you calculate it for that sport and progress or regress, if that makes sense.
Would then changing it to a 1.7, would that then change the need in terms of, these different months or these weeks leading into things, in your opinion?
It would, yeah. It would change the ramp, the magnitude of ramp, right? If at 1.7, you're going to be doing significantly less than you would be if it was 1.3 versus 1, etc. So that ramp would change. But again, this is just a thought process on describing how do we achieve in vivo, in-game volumes, and how would we think of a way to ramp somebody to that appropriately, like quantitatively, right? Because it gets really tricky to decide how many accelerations are we actually going to do in a training session. How many are we going to do in weeks 1 through? And you can use, linear, you can undulate, you can do so many things. But if in rugby, you're working with a rugby team and that acute to chronic is 1.7, that gives you an idea of where to sit, right? So to answer your question really clearly about the sweet spot, the sweet spot stuff is, you're right. There's a world where that doesn't exist, but it's largely defined by mediators and moderators as well, right? So for example, an athlete with higher levels of strength can sustain higher workload acute to chronic ratios, where athletes that are lower training age or have less can't sustain those higher workloads as well. So that stuff, the context of that, you're exactly right. 0.8 to 1.3 is not this like magic zone, right? But it's all about the context of the team, what they've been doing and where they're at, that will dictate that ratio and where that line actually is.
How can we as professionals then push the agenda forward and help out the younger strength and conditioning coaches get rid of this notion that it has to be within 1.8? Because like you did say, all right, it is kind of, it's accepted, but it's not necessarily true. So how can we push that forward and for the next generation and keep doing right by the next group of coaches that are coming behind us?
That's a really good question. We need to do mediator moderator analysis on data sets in high performance sport that includes force plate data, GPS data, and subjective monitoring data. Because right now we don't understand the whole picture. A lot of times we're just looking at it as, this athlete's acute to chronic ratio got really high. And then when that got high, people got hurt more often, right? But then that could also be biased because when you start fall camp, right, the ramp from not fall camp to fall camp is through the roof. So how do you prep and plan to get into that previously, right? To answer that clearly, it's going to need to start at a research level of understanding mediator and moderator analysis relative to acute to chronic. So when you're a strength coach and you understand the context of your team, what have they been doing, how sore are they, right? If a guy is really sore and his acute to chronic is high, the likelihood that he's going to get hurt might actually be high. But if a guy's been deloaded the day before and is pretty fresh and he's not sore, but his acute to chronic is still high, then the likelihood that he might get hurt might actually drop. You know what I mean? So it's the context piece is where we need to shift. And we need to start layering in the context and understanding the context and scope of acute to chronic ratios.
So again, looking back on, retroactively, when you're seeing this table 2, like for any of our strength coaches are like, okay, acceleration efforts for a cornerback, you're proposing doing about 62 acceleration efforts throughout the week or just on one day within that like 1 month prior to training?
Yeah, good question. So that's what they're going to get exposed to in a game situation or game day setting, right? So they're going to get exposed to that at one point over a 5-hour duration, basically, right? Or 3 hours of gameplay, etc. So this is when you have to add in the constraints of the model and the limitations, right? As a strength coach, you get a speed, agility, quickness session. You don't have 3 hours. I mean, you have a 2-hour session, maybe 30 of it is peaking, priming. Then you get into some Excel work, and then you're going to be hitting the weight room already. So the acceleration effort really is just identifying what are they getting exposed to in your session, because at the highest level, right, if you also understand that later that day, they might have a player ran practice. And if they have GPS on during that, what if they're getting 30 accelerations later in that day? Then you know that, well, I maybe need to be in the 30-ish ballpark in the morning, and then they're exposed to that in one cumulative day. To answer your question clearly, basically, like, can your guys handle that load and maybe not pop a tire? But it's not just one session, cram it into 30 minutes, right? This is thinking about the dynamic warm-up. This is thinking about maybe they're going to do 7-on-7 later in the day. Like, this isn't just
that was actually going to be my question. Like, is that taken into account? Like, could the strength coach who reads this be like, hey, if this thing right here says a wide receiver does 101 acceleration efforts in a game, even though they're going to have 56 plays, like, does my warm-up count? Does my dynamic warm-up count where they're doing a high knee run? Like, are they going, is that fast enough within it? Because any of the coaches that are listening out here, they haven't paused and watched and gone to this article. The distance
Yeah,
per acceleration here is all completely, doable. Being 1.3 meters is like a 2-yard acceleration. So to me,
right.
that high knee run would kind of be encompassing in that, right?
I would think so, yes. I mean, I think
Yeah.
you can cover that bucket. Also think too, like think a classic L drill, right? That's accel, decel, reaccelerate as well, right? So just by programming an L drill, if you have GPS yourself, and this is where I'm hoping that the world starts to take GPS data, right? We need to recognize how many accels, decels, and efforts are in an L drill. So when we program it, how does that relate to what someone's exposed to in game loads, right? Because the closer that you can get to making sure they can handle those loads in a safe, slow ramp for 3 months preseason, the more likelihood that the soft tissue stuff, the groin, the hamstring stuff, we can probably agree that that risk should start to drop as if you're exposing them to that, right? So you would include, yes, you would include dynamic warm up, you'd include change of direction days if that's how you program, is like one accel day, one change of direction, one max velo.
Yeah.
It still includes accels and decels too, right? So this gets it has to be a comprehensive model. Also understanding what these guys are getting exposed to in 7-on-7. In one play in 7-on-7, they start in a huddle.
What's up, everybody? Taking a quick break from the show to talk about one of our sponsors, Hawken Dynamic. I've been using Hawken Dynamics ever since I was at Towson. Still utilize it today when I'm at the private sector at Goldfinch. Even brought the plates from Goldfinch over to Centennial to do some force plate testing with the football team there. We've done force plate testing with other high school athletes. It is something that you need to get. If you want more help with it about how to practically use it and you want to reach out to us, feel free to reach out to us at service@strengthcoachnetwork.com. Not only do I utilize it with lower body assessments, I use it with upper body assessments, plyo push-ups, prone Y assessments. You can also utilize it for what I call an upper body isometric mid-thigh pull, where essentially you're doing a push-up at the strongest range and you're pushing into an immovable force, so a barbell, same way you do an isometric mid-thigh pull. Like I said, been using them for years. Valid, reliable. The customer service is fantastic. Go check out Hawken Dynamic in the link down below, and you will not be disappointed.
A guy might have an out and up route that's probably 2 accelerations. Then he stops and he has to jog back to the huddle. So he's getting another 30, 40 yards of distance just by jogging back, right? And so you're checking these boxes, but it's just, this is an idea and thought process behind, like, are we kind of on track with how we're building up to season, if that makes sense? And this is kind of like the thought process behind this is like almost like a milestone like thing. Like, are we kind of even in the ballpark of this, or are we cooking them before we even start? You know what I mean? This is just like checkpoint 3 months before. Are we starting to get exposure to these loads? Okay, we're 2 months. We got to build these things up. 3 months, or excuse me, 1 month before, 3 months into training. Are we really ready to go? Are these guys ready to handle the loads they're going to get exposed to in game time?
Yeah, no, and like for me, it's looking at this, I'd be like, all right, I got to make sure that we're getting at least all of these metrics in one session, minimum, a couple times during the week when you're preparing for practice. So that way, like you said, you're able to know, like, all right, in a game, you're looking at, like, say a linebacker's got 9 high velocity efforts. Okay, I got to make sure that they're doing that at least once or twice during the week, probably 3 times, considering how close we're getting to camp. But like you said, it does give you kind of some metrics to look at, like, all right, this is kind of some base minimum. But I think any of our listeners out there and our watchers out there understand that this does need to be tailored specifically towards your group of athletes, because that's a question that I get a lot, where it's like, hey, how does this relate to other teams? And like you said, this is just, hey, NFL data as an average. Don't worry, because maybe you're a team that runs more, doesn't have running backs on the field as much, or maybe like your personnel is really going to dictate how this looks, because like you said, all right, how y'all play football at Hawaii is going to be different than how we played at Towson or how we played at Iowa or at Maryland. Like, you've got to
100%.
find what fits your system.
Right. And that's why this is, I think the relationship between a sports scientist and strength coach, that's where a sports scientist can help the most. Laying the foundation like this, right? Not saying like this is how you need to do it, but like, let me help with volume progressions over time. And then let me track and monitor what are we actually getting when we have, like, if there's a player in practice, and they're out there, like, what are they actually getting in that? What does our first day of fall camp look like? And do we need to supplement fall camp with sprints? Like, are we getting enough high velo efforts in fall camp the way that that's designed, or are we not? You know what I mean? This is just a thought process to, like, make sure along the way you're somewhat near the zone that you want to be in.
Yeah, no, and that's and because again, getting back to like, understanding your own team and understanding your own metrics, like you talked about the DB with the threshold being set to 18 miles an hour. For some coaches, that's actually faster than their DBs can run. Like that might be faster than 90%. For others, that might actually be slower than 90%. Because if you run a thought
Yeah.
process like, hey, if their max velo is 21, 90% 18.9, right? Like, so that 18 miles an hour might not be a high enough of a threshold for you as the coach, depending upon the group of athletes that you have. Because again,
Right.
if you're at Slippery Rock State or, Bridgewater State, where I was at, like, okay, you might not be getting those dudes that are running 22 miles an hour as a DB. So that's
Right.
where you have to take it and understand how to use this model and apply it at your setting.
1000%. And I think with that too, right, we can just really think through this. It's if you got to get 8 high velocity efforts for, around 15 to 20 meters, whatever that is, as long as you're kind of touching that, you know what I mean? Even if you don't have GPS, this gives you an idea that you could pull GPS data that's published for another study, even if you don't have access to GPS units, and think, okay, in games in my conference, this is what guys are exposed to. This is maybe an appropriate load for my skills, big skills, and so on, if that makes sense too, right? So this kind of gives you a way to also take a public data set if you don't have access to GPS, because not everyone has the blessing to do so. And then you can create programs and progressions based on that as well.
Now, based off of what you said there, I love that you teed that up for me perfectly. That data set was 10 years old. What would be like, what do you think would have changed, the data being 10 years from when the research was able to get published? Do you think that changes anything within the demands of how we've kind of seen this offensive league, change within the sport of the NFL football that it is?
1000%. I couldn't agree more. The easiest way I can describe that is when I first started working with our ladies soccer team, we changed formations because we realized that a lot of our fast players weren't able to touch high velos in games. So we changed the formation, right, based on the GPS data.
Like you were the one to able help the team do that?
Yeah, because we basically
awesome.
realized that if you have a speedster that can hit 20 in the Big West, most ladies maybe can't touch that.
Yeah.
But they're not reaching that in gameplay. Hey, coach, heads up. Your superstar is not touching max velos. I don't think people can keep up with her. What if we move some things around? We did so, and then we went on a 12-game winning streak, and we won a conference championship, right?
Dude, that's what strength coaches in sport, like that's how it's supposed to be done.
But that's
folks.
it, though. That's what GPS is. And then if you take that approach to answer your question, right, our reverse acute to chronic and how we prep for the following season did change based on that alignment change. So the strength coach changed the prescriptions because we expose athletes based on the formation change to higher high-speed yardage. Nice. So we then thought, oh, well, okay, the month before, we got to make sure we touch these things, because if that's how we're going to play in gameplay, we would hate to see that 20-mile-an-hour athlete pop a hamstring because they haven't been touching those velos, right? So to answer your question, I would say it should change. We do this every year. Every team that has GPS, every year we change it because new athletes come in, new people come, the numbers don't change a whole lot, but it does change if there's like a philosophy change, and especially when I've seen a change in coaching staff, these things do change, right? Based on formational changes and in vivo real game, what's happening, these things change. And so how we think about prescribing for them changes as well.
What's up, y'all? Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about another one of our sponsors, Vitruve. I've been utilizing Vitruve for a while now, and I absolutely love the convenience of this app. The encoder is at a price that you cannot beat compared to the competitors. Also, I don't personally like the camera apps. I've known that they continue to break down, and I really enjoy having this encoder attached directly to the bar. Vitruve does that. Not only does it do that, but it'll show me velocity loss during the set, shows me average velocity, all of it right within the app. Not only that, for the app on the individual athlete, there's a Vitruve Teams app where now as the coach, I can see all the results from my athletes. I can API that into my team builder, and now everything that I'm trying to do, get better competition, better intent in the weight room, I am able to do with Vitruve. If you want more information about them, click the link down below, or you can ask us questions directly at service@strengthcoachnetwork.com, and we would love to answer those questions for you.
What do you have any plans for any, more research coming out there talking about, I mean, shoot, hearing just as like a fan, it's like, man, hearing something about that soccer, like that'd be pretty interesting to hear back, like looking back retroactively, like, all right, we had GPS on them and we went from a 442 or whatever it was, like, hey,
Yeah.
seeing and in like the title could be like, hey, an in season tactical shift affecting the physical demands within the four coactives. Like that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, we got a lot of things in the pipeline that are coming out. I'm really trying to focus right now on wrapping my head around the mediator moderator analysis in high performance sport. So for example, there's a lot of things that we do like athlete flagging using force plates and GPS and readiness subjective monitoring, right? For example, if an athlete's flagged on a force plate and they're reporting excessive soreness, does that actually decrease their max velo in gameplay? Like how do all of the components mesh, if that makes sense? That's really where my head is at in terms of research right now is trying to get a better understanding of how do we get our athletes to peak on game day and what things can we do in monitoring to get them there.
I'm going to ask the question that maybe some of our listeners are wondering, what does mediator and moderator mean? Because I'm like, hey, what does he mean by that?
Got you. Just think about how one thing interacts with the next. So like if you're really, really strong and I'm really, really weak, okay, and you're exposed to a high acute to chronic workload ratio and I am too, right? The likelihood that I'm going to get hurt is probably higher than yours. So strength would mediate the relationship between workload ratios and injury risk, if that makes sense. It's the one in between. It's adding context to relationships. So it's in sports, that's what it is, right? We always think about context, etc. Mediation is like, how does something play and interfere with the relationship between these other two entities, right? So that's where that acute to chronic workload stuff, you're right, 0.8 to 1.3 kind of fizzles a little when you add the context. How strong are they? What's their training age? If that's a freshman that has that, they might get hurt. But if that's a fifth year senior that's gone through that, they might have the prerequisite fitness to be able to handle that, right? So those acute to chronic ratios and injury risk change a lot based on the mediators, the quote unquote context. So I think a mediation is like the context piece, the subjective monitoring forms, force plate stuff, all those tests and things interact with the relationship between the output metrics that we actually care about in gameplay.
Gotcha.
Mediation is just adds context to relationships.
Gotcha. And so within the force plate stuff, is there like specifics? Are you making sure that we're always doing your jumps without arms, with arms, like with a pause? Like, is there any specific things that you're doing within that world to look at it?
Absolutely. And that could be a whole nother long chat. But basically, so force plate, now we're still in the world of if force plates are fads or if they really are what we think they are. We're still in that space. And what I mean by that is, for example, RSI mod, gold standard metric that's supposed to consider fatigue, right?
Yeah.
So right now our research is looking at what percent of athletes are flagged for RSI mod, so their coefficient of variation minus their average minus that value. Always hands on hips, no arm swing, because that varies the CV a little too much to be sensitive enough to detect the change.
Yeah.
What percent of those athletes are flagged, but they're also on the injured list, right? So I'm trying to add the context. If you just athlete monitor and just force plate test, but you don't look at the injured list, if someone has an RSI flag, what we're seeing is that, for example, in our beach volleyball group, 80% of the time, they currently have ankle, knee pain, self-reported pain, right? So then this begs the question, is RSI mod flagging really assessing fatigue, or is it actually assessing pain and they're changing their movement strategy, which it's output and movement strategy, right? So I'm trying to look at the whole picture, if that makes sense. I'm just trying to understand, if you say you're sore and you're flagged on the force plate, the likelihood that you're hurt or something is going on is probably high. As a sports scientist and systems engineer looking across the scope of an entire university, what's important for me, that all that I care about is the so what. So for example, if somebody is flagged for RSI mod, right now the literature kind of says they're quote unquote fatigued.
Taking a quick break from the show to talk to you about one of our sponsors, Powerlift. I used Powerlift when I was at Harvard, Maryland, and the University of Iowa. I was also part of the staff that had the new weight room at the University of Iowa, the 32-rack beautiful facility. I was a part of that. I also have Powerlift's equipment nowadays. Powerlift Strong, made here in the great state of Iowa, in the great country of the United States. They're able to work with you on any customizations that you need, logos, height, whatever it is, the limitations that you have. Their equipment is strong. The people there, they're very good people. Check them out in the link down below. And if you have any questions on how to work with them, reach out to us at service@strengthcoachnetwork.com, and we would be delighted to help.
But if they're hurt 80% of the time, rather than pulling them from the next practice, I need to send them to our medical staff to get evaluated to then decide the best course of action, not just reduce their workload, right? So then the if-then logic flow of that becomes the most important thing for me. Like, what do I do with the data? You know what I mean? Like, is RSI mod the best way to flag that? I don't know yet. That's why we're looking at all the metrics that are output from a jump, all 225 of them, doing a principal component analysis to trying to say, hey, if this thing comes up, you probably need to send that athlete to the medical staff, not just pull them out of practice because they need a lower workload in their GPS.
Yeah. Do you feel like it's giving you too many like false positives? Like, hey, this is an issue, but it's like, we already kind of know that Sally's got this because Sally's got a high ankle sprain from a soccer match.
Correct. 1,000%. And it's so, but what's important again there is the so what, right? That means, okay, we're on track. She's just recovering. This doesn't really add a whole lot to the context. But if you just think force plate from last Monday to this Monday and they're flagged, the traditional thought is, okay, they're fatigued, decrease their workload, right? But really, Sally might need more workload to get going. And she might need priming. She might need activation. She might need cold tub therapy. She might need, you know what I mean? There's so many if-then logic flow things that can happen that I'm trying to create and think through from a research perspective. What is that system approach, and how can we confidently say if this force plate metric is flagged that it's actually fatigue? Or is it more something like, Justin, and this is kind of where we're leading to, if an athlete is self-reporting that they're fatigued, their acute to chronic is pretty high, and they got flagged on the jump mat or on the force plate, but they're not on the injury list, now the likelihood that they're actually fatigued is pretty high. So I can feel pretty confident going into that weekly high performance meeting with that coach that the best action and plan of action for that player to re-get on track to peak at game day is probably reduce load. Right?
Gotcha. And within your model, are you got like, and I'm sure you probably are, but it's like, hey, we're going to make sure that we're always like, but then when you get into these sports like baseball or basketball, where it's like, all right, we got to be game day plus one, but not too close game day minded. Like that's got to be difficult too. Like shout out to you for handling
100%.
that.
1,000%. I mean, when you have 21 sports university wide, around 600 athletes that you're flagging and monitoring, it has to be a systems engineer's approach, and you have to think more of a systems engineer perspective and creating systems that lead to the best decision being made in that context.
No, I appreciate
If
you,
that
man.
makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, no, I that does. I appreciate you taking, 30 plus minutes out of your day to talk with me about this stuff, because as you can kind of tell, I find this stuff very fascinating, and I like to nerd out on this stuff, man.
That's awesome. I love it. No, I do too. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. This is my jam as well.
Appreciate you. Trevor, it's still the afternoon for y'all. What's about noon now?
It's noon. Yeah, cruising.
All right,
Yeah, a
man.
little lunch break.
Thank you for spending part of your lunch break with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin. Cheers.
Thanks for watching that video. If you enjoyed it, click right here for videos just like that, and make sure you click here to subscribe to our channel. Have a great rest of your day.